the very first thing that he says is that the way that they mourn is to be different. You see that in the second half of verse 1. You shall not cut yourselves or make any baldness on your foreheads for the dead. And then, for you are a holy people to the Lord your God, and the Lord has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession, out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. He talks about how they're to mourn, how they're to grieve. And the second verse says, remember, you are called out of all the nations of the earth. There's meant to be a distinction between you and them. And then he talks about a common practice, not common for us, but common for them in that time, that when a relative, a loved one dies, then there would be a cutting, a bloodletting ceremony to symbolize, oh, we're going to miss you, and so I'm going to, bleed a little bit to show that I'm sad that you died. This is how the nations grieve. And he says that the way that you grieve is going to be different. And my friends, this is very interesting. We can look at this historically and say, wow, the people of Israel, their funeral ceremonies were supposed to be different than the Canaanites and the Hivites and the Jebusites and the Hittites. Isn't that interesting? But also, we see that there's some very clear connections between what we read here in the Old Testament and then what the Apostle Paul instructs us in the New Testament. So if you like, you can turn to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, or you can just jot it down, and I'll read it. I'm going to read you 5 verses, and I'm only going to come back and focus on the first one. But he explains to them just some things that the Thessalonians really needed to understand. He says, we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so, through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep. For this we declare to you by a word from the Lord, that we who are alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a cry of command, with the voice of an archangel, with the sound of the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive, who are left, will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so we will always be with the Lord. Therefore, encourage one another with these words. Now, there are some very interesting sentences in there. We're not going to talk about the really interesting things about Jesus coming back. But here, he says, in essence, you have relatives, he says, who have died, and you are sad about it. He says, but we may not grieve as others do who do not have hope. He says, yes, of course, there is a grieving that takes place, but there is a distinction, he says, about the grieving that takes place for those that have hoped in Christ. We see there, in summarizing it, he says, because Jesus is coming back, and those that have already gone ahead, those that have died, they are going to be reunited with Jesus, and we'll all be together, and that final word is, therefore, encourage one another with these words. And, there is the fact that as Christians, we don't need to mourn as those who have no hope. Sometimes we do. And I'm not saying that this is always a declaration of how things are, but Paul is saying this is how it can be. That we do not need to be those that grieve as if there is no hope. Paul says to Thessalonians that because of what Jesus has done, because of what Jesus will do again, he says that we do not grieve as others do who have no hope. Talks about the hope of Christ, talks about the resurrection, and then says we're to encourage one another with these words. And so as we look back to, we could say our forefathers in the faith, those that followed God in the wilderness, they were told that the way that they mourned, the way that they grieved, was to be different. It was not to be as their pagan neighbors. It was to be distinct. And so likewise, Christians, the same thing. Just a reminder for us. And again, God will enable us to remember just these wonderful, fantastic truths of Jesus.